Hey, welcome back to another episode of Profitless on Purpose, the nonprofit accounting podcast where we take a look at current articles and goings on in the nonprofit world. And we also talk about some important topics on the show from an accountant's perspective, and not just one accountant. I'm one of your hosts, AJ Wheeler, but we have two other very capable and admirable accountants in our midst, Mark Palardy.
Hey.
And Lisa Sheldon.
Hello.
We actually have a mailbag question from last week's episode, so I'll kick it off over to Lisa to do our first ever mailbag question of the week.
All right. So, question for the POP crew. Do you have any recommendations on how to encourage your fellow board members to prepare, read through all the materials before the board meetings without sounding too pushy? Mark, you got some answers for us?
Yeah, actually, thanks, first of all, for writing in. We really appreciate that. I did find an article on this that I thought was pretty interesting. And it boils down to basically knowing your board and knowing their capabilities and what they're going to do. So if you have a lot of complex financials, try to include some graphs, try to include some other visual medium, because not everybody is coming at this as an accountant and might not be so familiar with financials. Other things you can potentially do is don't assume that everybody's going to understand your financials. Start slowly and train them in what the important numbers are to look at, so that when they get to a meeting, they might have at least looked at the bottom line or looked at specific categories for things that you might be looking at, and keep it simple. The complexity works when you're maybe talking to a finance committee and you're trying to drill down into the details. But if you're presenting to an entire board, they're not going to want to get into the weeds. And if they get financials that are 6 pages long, the likelihood of them reading it ahead of time are slim to none. Make sure your financials have sections that they know what they're looking at, and try to give a little bit of interpretation so that they're prepared to ask questions before the meeting commences. It's also just it's a crapshoot as to whether people have time to do it. You're not always going to get everybody engaged, but I think some of those solutions might help. You guys have anything else you think might help?
I think a timely delivery of your board materials is really important too. If you can get that stuff, a lot of times the boards that I was on, we would get the board materials like a couple days before, and like say the board meeting's on a Thursday and you get it the stuff on Monday. Well, you got work and family life and everything else going on. I would, the times that I had the most time to prepare for board meetings was when I got like a week ahead of time, and have then at my leisure over the weekend, I was able to review the material. And I think, Mark pointed out a good point in the article and kind of the suggestions that he made, where you keep it as simple as possible and you kind of lay it out for everybody there, having an agenda and knowing what you're going to talk about, and kind of then bullet pointing those topic discussions, I think really helps boil it down so it's not such a deep dive into everything that's going on with that board meeting, and it gives people a good time to prepare, I think. So having that stuff ahead of time, I think is, as much in advance as possible is really beneficial.
I think I agree with that. And I also think the other thing you could do is maybe summarize the key points, a one pager of here are the highlights of what's really important and what you really need to know. If you don't have time to dig into the details, at least you can get through that one pager that tells you, here are the big things you need to know. Here are the things that are important. Here are the things we needed to discuss. And I think that at least gives people an indication of what you're looking for and where you're looking to get some information. So, I think that the rest of the suggestions you've made are all great. I think that hopefully some of our board members that are listening will take or those sending information to board members will really think about what we're saying and maybe implement some of that.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you again to those who have commented. You have a captive audience here, so we certainly welcome more feedback, more comments on the videos, and just get in touch with us and let us know. AJ, I think you've got an article for us. Let's move into article time.
I sure do. So mine is from a blog post called Get Fully Funded. And the title article is How to Raise Funds for a New Nonprofit. So you got your 501c, whatever it may be, 3, 4, 6, whatever your designation is. You're starting a nonprofit. You have a good mission in front of you. But now how do you raise funds for it? And so I think there's kind of a myth, and the article goes into it. Should you pay out of your own pocket? Do you go for a GoFundMe page? Do you do a Facebook fundraiser? But I think the article kind of lays out some good steps here. And one of the big points they make is you have to become a fundraiser, especially in the early days of a nonprofit. You're really, it's not far from being an entrepreneur in that sense, where you have a product or a service essentially that you're offering to the community, and you need to be the biggest advocate of that product or service that you're offering. And so the first steps is learning and planning. If you don't plan, then you're planning to fail, essentially, is what they're saying. So fundraising is a craft and a skilled profession, and you need to put time into getting there. So they offer, of course, a course in that place. So they offer it in the article here. But anyway, they talk about how she got started in fundraising. But I think one of the other parts of the article or the blog post that's really is myths that won't bring in dollars. So they talk about finding grant opportunities. Often grantors are looking for a solid financial position. And if you're starting off, you don't have financials to really show anybody, so a community partnership with another nonprofit, or going out there and raising funds and showing what you're doing with the limited resources you have, I think is much easier than trying to go after grants to fund your programs. This is a good one. I'll hold fundraising events for my nonprofit. And they're the most visible form of fundraising. But to put on a fundraising event like a dinner or a gala or anything like that, you have to pay a bunch of money, and there's not a great ROI on those, especially in the beginning, if you don't have anybody supplementing meals and venues and that kind of stuff. And it takes a lot of time. I will fund my nonprofit with corporate donations. So corporate donations take time to cultivate relationships here, and that takes time. And when you're starting, you don't have any real, unless you do, but for the most part, they usually don't have those connections with a large commercial donor to be able to get funds out of it. Big gifts from rich people will fund my nonprofit. This is kind of the same conundrum that falls into the looking for corporate donations. You have to have relationships, and bequeaths and large donations from donors take a long time to cultivate. So again, time is of the essence here, and I don't necessarily know. Crowdfunding seems like an easy way to raise money. Unfortunately, everybody and their mother has a GoFundMe page. It's going to be very difficult for you to break through all that noise to be able to fundraise. And then the last one is I'll pay for everything until other people notice the great work you're doing. That's a recipe in an entrepreneurial world or even a nonprofit's world, where if you're funding out of pocket constantly, you're going to be dumping a lot of money in, and it's a real recipe for disaster, I think. So I kind of like to get our panel's take on, maybe if she missed something here, or if there's maybe something that she wasn't aware of when, giving these kind of myths to fundraising.
I think she hit the nail right on the head. I mean, I don't know that, from my perspective, a whole lot else out there. I think that bottom line, you're new in this game, and you got to go out there and fundraise. It's if you've got relationships, that's great. That'll get you started. But partnering with agencies, sometimes that works. Sometimes you can find a niche that they're not quite filling, and you might be able to partner with an existing agency and do some things for them. But bottom line is, you really got to be the one out there, feet on the ground and knocking on doors and asking for money.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Lisa. I think one of the other things this article does, which I think is a nice benefit, is to kind of get you in the mindset of trying to figure out who your donors are, right? Because fundraisers are great, and I definitely can confirm that fundraisers aren't the moneymaker that they pretend to be. They're the social facing aspect of a nonprofit that maybe comes around once or twice a year. But oftentimes the costs associated with that are so high that you're not walking away with a lot of money, but you're getting your face out there, and you're getting yourself known, and potentially bringing in donors that can continue to give throughout the year. And I think figuring out who your donor base is, are you going for a certain age group? Are you going for a certain demographic? Are you affiliated with some other way that you can, like everybody was saying, piggyback off of another organization, or at least become an ancillary program that can appeal to some other groups and really kind of ferret out who is willing to give, because it's going to be your donors who really believe in your program that are going to consistently give year after year and drive after drive. And I think another thing that this brought up, which is so important, is don't tap the well. Don't go after the fundraisers every single time with a desperate plea. I know we talked about that in a recent podcast. You don't want to just keep going after them. And finally they just go, uncle, we've all been there with, I personally can speak to organizations where, boy, after time that they're asking me for money, I'm just like, uncle, it's never going to be enough. And I want to be there to help, but I want the appeals to be real and genuine. And I want to, help in a way that makes sense. So those are some of my thoughts.
I thought one thing I thought of when I was reading through these was this really looks at the fundraising side of starting a nonprofit, but I would say the other side of that is your expenses. So locally, we have a woman that was started a nonprofit, and it's still run, and it's a very successful nonprofit. It's still run out of her garage, and it deals with supplies for foster children. And she's able to use the majority of donations that she receives to help the children that are needing it, the foster children care system, and the recipients of foster children, in a very quick and agile way, because it is run out of her and her overhead is low. So she's able to, any donations and money that she's receiving goes directly back into that. And she's able to really show an impact on the community. So I would say not only do you need to look at, of course, raising money, but I think you need to look at how you can do this as lean as possible, I guess is the best way to say it from an operational standpoint. So, heck, they don't even have an accountant, she keeps the books herself. So not that that's a great plan,
Yikes.
Not that that's a great plan for ongoing wise, but, realistically, if that's what you have to do in your first few years, that's what you have to do. Do you have another article for us, Lisa?
I do. Actually, I have two articles, and I read the first one, then I read the second one, and I thought, well, this kind of seems contradictory. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about both of them. So the first one was in the Nonprofit Times, and it talks about church funding is lagging other nonprofits in 2020. More than a quarter of all nonprofits reported about a 10% increase in donations during 2020 over 2019, which I think is great. Most of it went to non-ecumenical organizations, more so like medical research, food, things like just racial equity. So things that are in the forefront of our minds at this point. But they really said that church coffers really didn't suffer. Most of them did fairly well and had small increases in funding. And it just, obviously when you talk about things, but I found it just interesting in general overall that, a little bit of staff cuts in both situations, but really more just the fact that these organizations are getting more money, and the bigger the organization, it seemed the better that they did. So, the larger organizations, or a larger percentage of the larger organizations, had more increases in profits. So, and that was both for churches and for just other not-for-profits. But then another interesting thing that they said is it said that a lot of the respondents to the survey were forsaking the Paycheck Protection Program loans. And I don't know why they would do that. Unless they were not eligible, but it was just interesting to see that. And then the other article that I found that I read after that talked about, we're just talking about how these not-for-profits are now getting greater revenues, right? Most of them are seeing increases in revenues and contributions and things like that. And then saw an article that said Arizona not-for-profits lost millions of dollars, thousands of employees amid pandemic. And you look at the state of Arizona, and I'm not really sure what's different there. Could be the type of not-for-profit organizations that they have in Arizona, could be the services they provide. But, they talked about, they did a survey of 412 members of their Alliance of Arizona Not-for-Profits. They reported a total loss of $91 million and a 52% drop in year-end giving. And most of the average nonprofits lost between 25 and 50% of total revenue. So you see that big flip from what we saw in the first article that said most of these not-for-profits are now gaining revenues. And, and now Arizona, for some reason, has done this total flip. And they're having issues. So I just kind of thought that was interesting. It said nearly 80% of the people working for nonprofits before the pandemic were gone by February. So 2,098 employees were laid off or furloughed, and over 73,000 volunteers lost in Arizona alone. So it's really just an interesting kind of, differentiation between the two articles. Anybody's thoughts on that? Mark, you got thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, obviously there's a lot of data to puzzle through. And I think one of the things we'll have to watch is if this money comes back. The volunteers part, since you mentioned that kind of last, and that's fresh on my mind, it seems like a lot of volunteers tend to be older people and retirees. So it's not surprising to me that these retirees during a period of COVID, when their health is dramatically affected by these kinds of things, would loosen up on their volunteer commitments. I know my mom works at a food bank, or volunteers at a food bank, I should say. And during COVID, frankly, my sister and I wouldn't let her go in there because it's dangerous. It's dangerous for her. And, until she got fully vaccinated. And now she's said to me this past week, well, now I'm vaccinated and it's been 2 weeks and I'm looking to get back in the food bank. And great, now I feel comfortable and safe that can happen for her. But I think, going back to the two articles you mentioned, it's really the one about the churches was really interesting because they talked about kind of sectors of their revenue, and the revenue sector, they're bringing in money via donations, but some of their events and other places like where they would rent out the church, that was significantly down. And that makes sense, right? So, we don't know exactly what sectors Arizona has going on, but maybe a lot of their nonprofits are geared towards events, or maybe because of the warmer climate, there's more event-based or those kinds of organizations. Complete pure speculation on my part, of course, but it seems like with the different sectors, we're going to have to ferret out and then see once the money starts coming back. Stay tuned here for some further analysis, how this has impacted the nonprofit community, because I know the government grants and with the PPP and with other grant programs out there in government world, they've been kind of throwing money at organizations to try to get some of these relief programs in place. And, I think as some of the stimulus money dries up, are those nonprofits going to suffer in a different direction? So, AJ, what do you think about that?
Well, I think, if you look at nonprofit sector or for-profit sector, I think, the kind of well-established known names in whatever sector you're in have kind of weathered the storm, and those upstart shout-outs usually that were just kind of inking along really took the hit harder than anybody else during this pandemic. And I think the same is true with nonprofits. If you were a scrappy upstart nonprofit providing services that maybe weren't considered essential or ancillary to the pandemic, then I think maybe you might have lost traction during that time, especially if you're in an industry that requires like face-to-face, which was kind of surprising to hear how churches were staving it off, because I always thought of churches being much more social, right? That their coffers got filled on Sundays because everybody showed up for mass and put in their $5 in the collection plate. But and then an appeal was given at service, to provide money to the coffers, essentially, to fund the programs and such. So good on them for finding a way around it and holding virtual services and getting virtual donations that way during the pandemic. But I would say if you're not a well-known or an ancillary kind of help to the pandemic that was going on, you probably did lose traction. But for those that were in, like say mental health, substance abuse, any kind of senior care or healthcare kind of areas, you probably increased staff during this time because your services were so needed and funding was being made available to you. But if you were outside of that, the funding's got to come from somewhere. So the cash spigot somewhere else got turned off, essentially, you know what I mean? And your funding dried up there. You also probably, and I don't know about the size of these Arizona nonprofits that lost millions, but if you were relying on community involvement, especially from a lower income kind of base, that was all crippled during the pandemic. So you're really having to rely on larger donors, larger foundations, larger grants or governmental grants to stave that off, So I guess it makes sense, but I like to Mark's point, I think it'll be interesting coming out of this, seeing what the rebound is, or how it takes off.
Yeah. One other point I remembered as you were talking, AJ, is that anecdotally, I have quite a few friends who maintained their employment through the pandemic, right? They were frontline workers, they were in the hospitals, et cetera, and they used their stimulus money and gave it away to charities, right? So that might be some of the artificial influx that we're seeing because they said, well, I don't need this money and I'm going to give it to an organization that's helping people that do. So I'm wondering, and I don't know that there will be any metrics to measure this, but I'm wondering if that has anything to do with some of this influx we've seen, because it would be very easy for somebody who is fully employed to say, well, let's just donate that to our church. We know they'll get it to the people who need it. And, that's a viable method.
I like that. I think that's probably something that we'd like to see maybe going forward. We'll see if there's anything that comes out of that. Mark, you have an article to share with us to wrap us up with on our articles?
I do. It's a little bit lighthearted, but I figured we'll take it easy for the third article this week. This article is from Future Fundraising Now, and it's called 3 Reasons Those Corny Thermometers Improve Fundraising Results. So, we've all seen those thermometers, whether they're outside of someplace raising money for some new project at the local church or whatever, the food bank trying to raise money for the year. So they're successful for 3 reasons. Fundraising thermometers appeal to our preference for visuals, kind of obvious. Fundraising thermometers give us a job to do. We all kind of like to feel like we have accomplished something. Oh, and I just spoiled the third one. Fundraising thermometers make us feel accomplished. And personally speaking, I think it's almost like the gamifying of fundraising, right? You put something on the wall in your break room where you're trying to raise money for whatever it be, or even you could see a tub full of Toys for Tots as its own kind of thermometer, because people are encouraged in the workplace to fill that up with toys for needy children. So I'm curious if you guys have any pro or con thermometer thoughts.
I actually have a con thought on this. I'm going for a con here, but if anybody's ever watching, I highly suggest you do. It was very interesting. Print the Legend. It was a documentary film on Netflix, and it was essentially about 2 upstart 3D printers manufacturers, MakerBot, and the other one was I forget the other one. Anyway, the one company that decided to go large, shut down its operating system and make it priority, was essentially getting ready to be bought, and they had a countdown clock that essentially was counting down to when they made a big announcement, and it did exactly the opposite of what you thought it would do. It didn't motivate anybody, and it didn't provide ease of anybody working there. Everybody became very ominous about this countdown clock. It was just this big red and black countdown clock that at the end of it they were going to make some announcement, and so and this went on for weeks, and people moved away from that company left, right, and center. I think if the thermometer is deployed correctly and you're using it as a metrics to, generate more, donations, if somebody sees that and it's low on the, the thermometer's low on the scale and they're like, man, we got to get this up. We need to donate money. I think that's good. Same thing is if it's at the very top and, it just has a little bit more to make, then people are like, let's top this off and finish it off. The problem where it can be is if you're using this to motivate your development department and you're holding it over their head that the thermometer is only 1/4 filled, what are we doing to get this done? I would say you need to engage better with your development department to help them succeed, and so I think they can be great from an outside perspective, but if they're used as a motivating factor or like a report card on fundraising, there might be external situations where you only make it halfway up the thermometer this year, and it has nothing to do with the quality of your development staff, or maybe it does, and maybe that the thermometer wasn't a good motivating factor, and there needs to be, I guess it just doubles down back on the executive director or whoever's leading the development department to make sure that your staff and and who's working on these development deals is well motivated in a way that's like fulfilling and not so anxiety inducing as a countdown clock or a thermometer being held over their head. So I think they're great, but I guess, the asterisk on the end of that is be trepid with, deploying this as a motivating factor for your internal staff.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, AJ. I've seen that happen where, I've been involved with an organization that had those kind of metrics and everything was held over this one woman who was the development staff, right? And anytime something didn't meet the board's expectations, all hellfire came down on her, and there was no discussion about what happened, how things happened. There wasn't the support from the board there, and so I can see how that was very demotivating. But from a perspective of a donor, if I'm walking into a building and, my organization is doing a fundraiser for something and I see that thermometer there every day when I walk in the building, it's front and center, right? I see it every day. I know what's going on. I know that they need to donate money. And if the expectation is that the employees are donating money to some cause, it gives me a sense of either, yeah, I think my donation did make a difference, or, oh, maybe I should donate a little more. Or, oh, crap, I haven't made my donation yet. Let me go do that right now. So from that perspective, I think it kind of keeps things in front of you, gives you that, out of sight, out of mind, right? You don't see it, you forget about it kind of thing. But if it's right there and you're seeing it every day, I think it can be very motivating to make things happen. It can be used as a tool to have discussions, but again, don't hold it over your employees' heads or don't over your fundraising department, your development team. You can't beat on them if things aren't going the way you want them to go. It can be used as a basis for discussion, just like any other metric, but it's got to be used in the right way.
Yeah, I just remembered one of my thermometer pet peeves, if you will, and you'll appreciate this as accountants. I have seen thermometers where they're not to scale, right? Where they want to artificially make it look like the fundraiser is going better than it is. So like the first 10% of the funds is like 3/4 up, and then it's just little tick marks going up. And you're like, no. So I always find that hilarious.
I guess it goes back to, right? Like, you show me a graph and I'll make it look however you want, or you give me some data and I'll make it however you want, look however you want. So. All right, I think that does it for our article. And now it's discussion time with the Pop Crew. All right, this week's topic is resources for nonprofits. So hopefully everybody's done their homework here. And I guess I can start us off. One of the things I don't think a lot of nonprofits know about that they can use as a resource if you have your 501c3 letter is actually Google has grants for AdWords and AdSense. And so if you just Google nonprofit Google grants, and, do it in that order, because if you put Google nonprofit grants, you'll get a listing of every grant available around the country. But if you specifically say Google AdSense words, it's a very easy application, and you get free Google marketing towards your nonprofit. And a lot of nonprofits don't know about this. And they even have trainings to help you with SEO searches and get your nonprofit on the front page of your local area if you're Googling that kind of stuff. So that's one of mine. And the second one I would mention, and probably most nonprofits know about this, is Techsoup. And if you don't, Google it right now, Techsoup. As long as you have your IRS designation letter and you get signed up with a membership over there, you get all kinds of software at super deep discounts through Techsoup. And you can buy things from Dell, computers even. QuickBooks Online, for instance, is something like some outrageous price of $50 or $75 a year, which is well below what market rate is for QuickBooks subscription for a year. So if any of those two help you, please leave a comment in the below and let us know. But I'd kick it to the rest of the group here. I'm interested to see what resources you guys have found for nonprofits.
I found, Google Suites, right? G Suites. You can get, and this is free for non-for-profits. You get your Google Suites, you get a domain name, you get Google Docs, you get Calendar, you get Drive, which is a great way to store information. So if you're a smaller not-for-profit especially, and you don't have the capacity to store all these things and to maintain this internally, it's a great way to start. It's a great way to get yourself going and moving forward. And that one is totally free. Another one that is totally free is Canva Pro, and it is basically, think Photoshop, but it allows you to help your marketing campaigns. It gives you some free, just some clip arts and things like that are really going to help you with some of your marketing campaigns, and all of that is free. There's a free YouTube nonprofit program. The only problem with that is you need to have 1,000 followers. If you have 1,000 followers, you get a great deal, because they will give you access to their production studios and to their editing tools to allow you to film your YouTube videos. So that one's really cool, but again, you got to have 1,000 followers. So that one's a little tough, but I'm going to pass it over to Mark and see what he came up with.
Yeah, I think there's so many resources for nonprofits out there. People really want to help nonprofits, and I kind of divided a list. I'm gonna do it a little more rapid fire, because there's so many. There's the online platforms, which we've kind of been discussing, and then there's the real world practical things that you can do too. So let's start with one of those. Many banks, and especially credit unions, will offer free banking if you're a nonprofit. So search around. Some of the larger banks have nonprofit streams where you can get in there and get really high quality service. I'm bank agnostic, so I don't really want to mention any, but look around. There are definitely banking situations. Look for venues that are going to offer you free, potentially free rental to hold a fundraiser. I know here locally in Portland, we have we're the home of Lagunitas Brewing Company. They have a location here in town where if you're a nonprofit, you can actually get their venue rental for free, and you can set up your own nonprofit fundraiser there. I mean, so many different kind of practical things. Jumping over on the tech side, I like both AJ and Lisa's suggestions. Techsoup I use all the time with some nonprofits, but there are some other websites that are for nonprofits specifically, like Grant Advisor, where you can just find anonymous reviews of different foundations that give grants and see if it fits your particular program and see if it's even worth your time to be applying for a grant there. LinkedIn for nonprofits, they have a section. Eventbrite, they allow nonprofits to use free resources to plan fundraisers and for ticketing. Double the donation. It can look for matching programs for some of your donors so that you can get free money from their companies when they're giving to you. There's a website called NTEN technology, so N10, which talks specifically about technology in the nonprofit sphere and software that might be useful for you and different ways to accomplish different things for less. So, and again, another website I'll point you to, the Network for Good, lots of articles, lots of ways to go about doing things for nonprofits, some free, some cheaper, but really just a wealth of knowledge out there.
All right. Wow. That was a really good, quick fire kind of resources there. We'll leave our links to our suggestions and our resources down in the description of this podcast on YouTube. And for any of our listeners, if you have a resource or know of something that maybe we missed or that you think other people should know about, leave it in the comments down below so we can share with everybody else. And we'll refer people back for if they ever need nonprofit resources.
Thank you for joining us for Profitless on Purpose, the podcast where we put fun in fund accounting. If you liked our podcast, go ahead and give us 5 stars. And if you really liked us, you can go ahead and listen to our sister podcast, None of Our Businesses, on our same YouTube channel. Hopefully, we'll see you next week. Have a great week.